cannot give you two exact day in the life of an Army chaplain. They're so different. And that's the beauty of it.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest in this episode is Lisa Northway, and we'll be talking about how to have vibrant ministry even after the age that most people retire. Retirement just isn't what it used to be. In the U.S. military, it's mandatory at 62 years of age, but U.S. Army Garrison Chaplain Major Lisa Northway is an exception to that. Lisa, who's been called the Grandma Moses of the Army Chaplaincy, has received permission to extend her chaplaincy for a few more years. So in this podcast, I talk with Lisa about how to have a vibrant ministry past retirement age, including the value of long-term experience in today's ministry environment, how to pace yourself for the long term, how not to block the way for younger ministers, and how to mentor younger ministers. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with my quick take on pacing your schedule for long-term ministry effectiveness. Well, Lisa Northway, welcome to the Church Lobby. It is so nice to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Karl.
Well, you and I have some familiarity with each other in church lobbies because I was thinking about this the other day. You are, so far, the guest that I've had on my podcast who I've known the longest.
Wow. Is that making me feel especially old?
Or me, or we're just...
Or qualified?
Yeah. Because I mean, about the only people that I would have on the podcast that I've known longer would be like my parents and my sisters. I mean, I've known you longer than we've known each other longer than we've known our spouses.
That is correct. That is absolutely right.
You looked shocked by that, like it just occurred to you that was
yes,
what we have.
So wow, because I'm just celebrating my 34th wedding anniversary, and that's it by today's standards in the culture I live and serve in. That's like eon. That's a long time to be married.
We just had 41, so we've known each other. I was 16 when I met you, because that's when we moved to Modesto. And so your brothers were a couple of my closest friends, so you were just basically the irritating little sister.
Yes, I was probably 13.
Yeah, so at 16, 13, but today that seems like that's nothing. But back then, that 3-year gap was...
Oh, yes, you were the older pastor's son.
Yeah. So we've known each other a long, long time, and we've had the chance to spend some time in ministry together as well. You and Garrett, me and Shelley have gotten to know each other. So we spent some time in Germany, working with the chaplaincy there and at the Army base there. And you had me come up to Alaska to do some work there when you were stationed there for a short period of time, although you got out of town by the time I came.
That was so unfair.
That's the thing about the Army, right? If they tell you to go, you got to go, whether your friend's showing up or not.
It's not, we have to realize it's definitely a humbling experience continuing, because we're planning, the military is planning years out beyond our own lifespan and trying to make it better than we found it, and then preparing for the next generation of warriors to step up.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, our audience is not primarily chaplains. So give us some description. How did you find yourself getting into Army chaplaincy, and what does that look like on a regular basis to bring us up to speed as to what you do?
All right. Well, I think for me, my spiritual formation, like a lot of other people, it started in childhood. And I'm from a denomination that had a girls' club. We called it Missionettes. We would gather and get to hear stories of other missionary children. And in my denomination, it was 2 kids. Their names are Chris and Kim Bueno. And I was told about how they would run to the mailbox every day to get mail to be able to get something from the United States, as they were in Panama at the time. And that started my little girl heart in realizing there are people who willingly or unwillingly become part of ministry away from home. And that heart away from home that needs the nurture, the care, the spiritual retaining, so to speak. And so that positioned me to start looking at those places where people are ministering, living, and serving in this other place,
Yeah.
not in their hometown church, not in the place in the tradition that where they were raised up in. And over that, I would say the next decade and a half, having that come full circle and being part of a thriving singles group at a church in Modesto, California, and having it was mostly men who came home from leave and asking them, well, how's church? Because it was everything. Even as I was studying for ministry, knowing I was called to ministry, and their faces would go pretty much deadpan. And I saw that commonality and I asked, what is that? Because I knew that chaplains existed only because I have a step uncle. He's since deceased, but he was then an active duty Army chaplain. So I knew they existed. I knew there was a place for people to continue to cultivate their faith and continue on wherever they were at. And so they would tell stories and they said, you just don't understand. It's challenging. Sometimes we don't actually feel like the chaplains are working with us. Sometimes they are actually obstacles depending on their bias and how their faith tradition informs them. And just having a Bible study is a challenging thing. And for me, I think it was sort of a social justice issue also combined with the idea that the government was endorsing people with churches to present the gospel to a new generation of warriors. And the fact that some people were actually blocking that, it struck me in a deep way. And so through a series of confirmations, some altar experiences, I clearly heard the voice of God saying, if you're willing to leave the comfort of your mother's home and your hometown, I will use you. It came through multiple times. I needed multiple confirmations because anybody who knows me, including you, Karl, know I was the least likely girl, in our youth group to ever put on a pair of combat boots and, say, see you later. That answers one of your questions. Go ahead.
Yes. So then what does chaplaincy look like? What kinds of things do chaplains find themselves doing on a regular basis? A lot of it is very pastoral. I know because I've spent time with you on the military base and I've talked to a whole bunch of other chaplains, and there is a big overlap in the Venn diagram, but there's a bunch of it that obviously is very different in the military circumstance. So walk us through some of that.
So I cannot give you two exact day in the life of an Army chaplain. They're so different. And that's the beauty of it. I think I might be challenged to go back to traditional ministry. There's an adrenaline rush that becomes very addictive that requires us to take care of ourselves differently. So I might have to show up somewhere early for a staff meeting or a situation that's happened overnight, first thing in the morning. I was called in, I'm thinking yesterday, a few different problem solving situations. We also answer to commanders. It's not just about us. It's actually called the commanders, not the chaplain, master religious plan. And so we represent, just like a lot of other directorates, we represent the commander's religious support plan. And some of that is very fluid, even though there's constants throughout the year. And last night, for instance, I got a phone call. They couldn't get a hold of a certain chaplain, even though I'm not a battalion or brigade chaplain now. They were looking for a chaplain who would be available and they could get right into a situation and say, can you meet us down at the emergency room? We have a soldier who had a suicide ideation, and they've asked to speak to a chaplain. So we're getting to go where people ask us and want us to go, want us to show up. So we run to the battle in different kinds of ways that you might not see. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful privilege in a time where we are learning that much of the church, as a whole, is outsourcing a lot of their pastoral care. We're in the thick of it. We're in the heat of the battle, and it's exciting. And we get to see some outcomes that we don't appreciate, but we also get to make an impact, to make a difference in a very tangible way on a daily basis.
Yeah, it is. It's remarkable, the work that you do. And the reason I wanted to bring you on wasn't to recruit chaplains, although chaplaincy is, I think, maybe an under-noticed ministry, and something that we need more chaplains in, all from hospital chaplains to military to police departments to all kinds of different places, to school chaplains and so on. So if you feel called to chaplaincy, we do encourage you to take a look at that as something seriously that God does call people to. But particularly, I wanted to talk to you because we follow each other on social media, and you've been posting recently about you are now at or really near what would be normal retirement age, but that has been extended for you. So tell me what that situation is.
So Traditionally, the mandatory retirement age for any soldier, anybody in the active duty military, is 62. And I was informed a few years ago that the year before you turn 62 is the only time you've got just your birth month of when you turn 61 to submit a packet to extend longer beyond there.
You got
And
a 30-day window, and if
30-day
you don't
window.
have a precedent, wow, okay.
That's it. And the process will take usually about 6 months to hear back. And I was approved by the Secretary of the Army recently this year, that I would get to stay until the age of 64 in a few months. I just raised my hand for another time. And being the first woman chaplain that we know of who has received that distinct honor. And it is so exciting to still be serving.
Yeah, now they've called you the Grandma Moses of Army Chaplaincy.
Yes, we're having some fun with that.
How does that hit? How you being called Grandma Moses? Tell me, is that a positive? Is that a negative? How does that feel, and what does it mean?
It's a positive. It's all positive.
Right.
I mean, the fact that there could be a Grandma Moses of the Chaplain Corps, it sends a message to a lot of people who are serving right now and thinking, okay, 20 years, it's good. Or what about that? What about serving past 62? Could that be a thing? And I will tell you, I've been very public about the possibility, because it's not about only being a chaplain recruiter, but also retaining some of those people who are already here. Can you keep going? Do you have the joy? Do you have the desire? Because God's calling hasn't stopped. It's just, how will that be shaped in your 6th decade, which is, research says, is the most productive decade. And I think there's something about that, that we tell ourselves, we think it's now or never. And so I have been very busy being a peer mentor to a lot of chaplains who say, hey, I heard you got this extension. Tell me about this, or can you help me with my packet? So I present it sufficiently, and I am truly considered to continue serving also. That is a good news story all around, because it's not about me so much. It's about, hey, let's bring some other grandmas and grandpas along here. And we are truly, when I tell you about, when I go out to the basic training sites, especially, and even around the general Army audience, the soldiers who are in their first decade of service are young enough to be my grandchildren.
Yeah. Now, real quick, for those who aren't familiar with the Grandma Moses moniker, we're not just taking Moses from the Old Testament and putting the word grandma in front of it.
Exactly.
Real quick, who was Grandma Moses?
So she is somebody, and she's an American heroine. Norman Rockwell celebrated her, even painted her, put her on his magazine. She's somebody who really bloomed, who flourished really in her early 70s. And her paintings are worth so much. It's beyond I'm not an artist, art curator. Yeah, priceless, pretty much. Yeah. And you think about that, I've always considered myself a late bloomer. I've come to realize that it's not so much when you bloom, is that you bloom at all.
Yeah. So it's not about just simply, I'm going to stay longer, but it's about the age, the longevity, the seniority, and the experience, bringing something of value to the table that you could not have brought in previous decades because you didn't have the experience of those previous decades yet.
Right. I was certainly going through the motions and doing my job, hitting all those things, getting the training, but to be able to walk into a space like last night and be able to have them break down, when did it get bad? When did you go to a dark place? And helping them be self-aware of what was going in their mind, and realizing there's probably connection with an event much earlier than life, and things sort of came crashing together. And it's an opportunity for them to get the healing now, especially if they know they've got someone who's committing to be alongside them for the way ahead.
So you mentioned earlier that a lot of the younger soldiers are in fact young enough to be your grandsons and granddaughters.
Yes.
What about your age and experience and seniority is an add-on for them? How is this a positive for them that they're talking with someone who does have that kind of life experience?
Well, most of their leaders, their drill sergeants and different situations they're in, are around their same age or just a few years older. And so when you're able to provide that context, a living context, that in some way, as you begin to talk with them, they realize, oh, I'm having a different conversation. I'm having a very adult conversation for my wellness. This person isn't just my parents' age. They come with the wisdom of my grandparents' age. They've lived life, they've survived it. And also the idea that I've been serving for over 36 years. I've walked and I've marched in combat boots with them before they were born.
Right. So there's a real respect for that rather than a looking down upon that you primarily receive?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm quite sure, the hard transition on the other side, when I eventually transition from the military, it's going to be a little bit of a wake-up call that our culture may not fully respect that age and experience. But I'm enjoying it now.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no way to predict the future, obviously, but I think you may be pleasantly surprised. I think there's far more, in general, I think there's far more respect for those who have that experience, as long as you come at it in the right way. If you're just going to be the get off my lawn guy, then that's one thing.
Right.
But when you approach it as you do and as I try to do with, hey, I've got something I want to help you out here, I want to move you forward with that, I think there is a great deal of respect now, far more than there was when you and I were kids. I mean, you and I always had kind of a healthy respect for those who were seniors over us. We were maybe a little different in that way, but the kids around us would be like, oh, mom and dad. That's not quite as much, and especially not towards those who are the grandparents' age like you and I are right now. I think there's a higher degree of respect. So, well, maybe I'll have you back in 3 or 4 years and we'll see how it's going after you step out. But for now, let's talk about what's happening here. One of the things I was asked, I was on somebody else's podcast a couple of weeks ago, and at the end of it, they said to me, what would you like an interviewer to ask you about? And I'd never been asked that question before. So I'm not going to do that to you, but unless something comes out of that you want to give me. But as I thought about it, I thought, okay, here's what I wish more people would ask me. And it's this: how do you pace yourself for longevity in ministry? Because most of the questions that tend to come are about, how do I get this done now? How do I get my numbers up now? How do I hire staff now? But there's not as much curiosity, at least I haven't discovered as much curiosity about, okay, how do I pace myself over the long haul for the long haul? So what lessons have you learned and that you can help our listeners with to understand how have you behaved in a way that you're not just able to, but excited about extending your time in active ministry past retirement age?
Well, I think earlier in the career ministry, I would say like my first deployment, being stationed at Camp Bury in the gateway to Iraq during the surge and being a lieutenant. And I was there in a year where 40,000 troops went through my camp and they couldn't find their chaplain. There's a lot of chaos. And they would just line up at the chapel for wanting to speak with a chaplain. And a lot of them were making peace on their way to war. Some of them were not afraid of the enemy as they were afraid of counterproductive leadership. We had units that had not been mobilized especially in the National Guard Reserve since World War II. So a lot of edgy things were going on. And it was nothing for me to do 10 counselings a day and not make it to the dining facility to feed myself and get good nutrition. And I found myself literally eating out of care packages, which means it's a good news story that people were sending me care packages.
Right.
But that's not good self-care. And I remember as I was transitioning to go home and realizing that I need to do things differently. I had a little bit of weight to take off when I got home. I think I gained 15 pounds just because you're sitting and you're doing counseling. And you think about that. That is the challenge of a lot of people in ministry. We're so busy and we eat and then, that whole vicious cycle. And you cannot maintain that. You cannot maintain on activity. First of all, we live with the threat of losing our jobs, being kicked out of the military if we weigh over a certain amount. And so learning new tools and realizing that I need to be able to look someone in the face and say, I am not the best chaplain for you right now in this minute. I have not eaten. I'm going to do that. And I can pick back up with you in a few hours or first thing in the morning. And I'm going to meet you where you are. And we're going to go after what brought you here today. And really, it makes me a safer caregiver and it builds trust. Not just say, hey, I'm too busy. I got to go. It's my turn. But be able to lovingly speak the truth in love about yourself, your limitations, that God-given limitations, and really let that set the pace for big picture for your ministry over the next few decades. And that's what I've done. And adding more skills, working out as a soldier in my 20s and 30s looks different now in the sixth decade. And I have no shame with that.
I hate to break it to you, but you're in your seventh decade.
Oh.
Your teens were your second decade. Your 20s were your third decade. I just added 10 years to your life. Sorry about that.
I feel like I should have another party or something.
You're in your
that.
60s, but it's we are both in our 60s, but it's our seventh decade.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. It's one of those weird little things. Sorry to have aged you so dramatically right there.
It's okay. I'm hoping I'm up for that. And part of that, the number one way we saw coming out of Operation Iraqi Freedom and some of those missions was that we saw a number of chaplains coming home, and sometimes the day after, the week after, soon after, literally dropping dead, because it's the shift. And you hear stories of people who died the day after they retired because they kept a certain momentum. And so my mission, I think for me personally, and I try to teach this, is saying how in these transition years, my husband has said, Lisa, you can't keep this pace up, and live what you believe, practice what you preach, unless you figure out how you can come down from that adrenaline rush. And some of the maturing, for instance, is I remember a couple of years ago being a brigade chaplain, and so used to being in that place where you run to the battle. And I had two captain chaplains under me, and they reported there's incidents, soldiers down, and it was a field exercise. And I was with my supervisor, and he said, Lisa, do you trust your chaplains? I said, absolutely, sir. I trust them completely. They're great. He says, so let them do their job. And I had to go away, and I sat in my car in a parking lot, and the adrenaline was still pumping because I had never not run to the battle. And I literally was like banging my head on the back of the headdress until I could get it out because it was so high. And so I could calm myself and find this other place where I could let down and let the younger generation do what I had done in my younger generation.
I think that maybe for those of us who are doers, who are runners to the battle that you and I and so many of our listeners are, for caregivers, for those who do that kind of a thing, I think it may be even harder for us to pace ourselves for the long run because there's always an urgent thing to do. There's always something that seems that we've got to be at it right now. And there may even be this feeling of guilt when we're not engaged and active and on the front line for everything. But as we age and hopefully mature, because those aren't necessarily the same thing, as we age and hopefully as we mature, we then can discover our own rhythms so that, you mentioned earlier, 10 counseling sessions in one day. I mean, that's ridiculous. So it's not just the amount of time. Those are 10 hard conversations. Those are 10 conversations where people are loading onto your shoulders some of the heaviest things of life. And even though they aren't your burdens to carry, you are still there to hear that. And as a person who cares, that's going to weigh on you. And so as those things happen and as we get used to it, we need to develop rhythms where we say, okay, I'm going to have this particular day where I've got to do those 10 in a row. Or any pastor can look at it and go, I'm going to have a heavy Sunday this Sunday where we've got 2 services and we've got a water baptism and we've got counseling in the afternoon, whatever. When you look ahead and see that, then you need to plan for a rest cycle that is equivalent to the output cycle. And if you don't plan for it, it will not happen.
And we will plan for it. And I will be honest with you, I would say as military chaplains, we are often deprived by the
orders.
Yeah, the urgency of the immediate, right? And so we can never have the luxury of ceasing to get after our self-care. We have to keep going back to it. Sometimes it feels like the 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Yeah.
But we have to realize we're worth the work.
As you're saying it, it's reminding me of the advice that every young mom is given: sleep when the baby sleeps.
Yes. That is exactly right. Deployments are sort of a microcosm of that. I was told by a commander in Iraq, chaplain, you need to be at every briefing before the soldiers go out the wire. That's 24/7 ops. So that meant there might be, let me see, 3 times 24 hours, they would be going outside the wire. And if I needed to beat everyone, whether it was at midnight, 5 in the morning, or the middle of the day, I had to figure out when I was going to sleep, when I was going to eat, all those things, and then take care of the soldiers who were inside the wire who were coming in for counseling.
Wow.
We have some amazing training grounds.
Yeah, that sounds extraordinary. So the pacing is really, really important if we're going to stay in for the long run. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are 2 things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. Now let's move to something that when I was younger, it's a different situation now. When you and I were younger, at least in our denomination, there were a lot of pastors vying for a few places in a few churches. Today, it's the opposite. Today, churches are having a harder time finding pastors because there are fewer people coming up in the pastorate. But back in that day, there were situations I clearly remember where here I am, I'm a young pastor, I'm looking for a church to pastor, and I know that there are a handful of churches out there that could really use a new pastor. They've been struggling for years, but the only reason I can't even put my name in to pastor that church is because there's some old guy who's in that church and is there longer than they should and is not doing what needs to be done and should have been out of there a while ago. This isn't typical. This isn't normal, but it was more normal back then. I told myself then, when I get to be that age, I won't be that guy. I'm not going to be the guy who overstays his welcome. So let's talk about that, because we're talking now about extending our ministry years fruitfully past normal retirement age. How do we do that without being the person who's in somebody else's way?
So during that first deployment, I remember the only woman in my denomination who'd served for any length of time as on active duty, Priscilla Mott, congratulated me. She said, "Well, you've arrived." She says, "Now you need to start preparing for your exit, for your retirement." And I was a little bit offended. I said, "Hey, I thought you'd be able to celebrate. Hey, I've arrived. I'm a combat veteran," because that's where I was. I was at the time it was considered a combat environment. And I just tried to close my mouth, but I reflected on that for a while. But she said to me, "Lisa, the best military chaplains are those that aren't scratching and clawing to stay in." And so that always stayed with me. And so I thought, even when I was working on my packet to be able to extend, am I scratching and clawing to stay in? No, I don't feel that way, that I'm not in a place where I have something to prove. I still have joy. And I feel like that is a God-given gift. And because he's no respecter of persons, he offers that to everyone. If a person doesn't have that joy, they can come before him and receive that. Say, "God, give me joy." Maybe I served the first 10 or 20 years without it, and I was just going through the motions. But to be able to experience that fullness, the full gifts of God that he wants us to have, he designed for us to have, to enjoy that ministry as much as possible. And that can sound very Western, because I know there are places where people are called to hard ministries, and I may not be a lot of joy, and I want to be aware of that and the fullness of God's ministry around the world, the reward, the joy set before Christ that allowed him to walk into Jerusalem knowing that it was going to cost everything, but it was worth it to know that in the presence of the Father, there would be this joy that was going to be saved, reserved for that time also.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that wonderful advice, because I think the way I heard it and the way I would interpret it for pastoral ministry would be, don't go around scratching and clawing to stay in a position.
Yes.
I think a desire to stay in active ministry is one thing. A desire to hang on to a position after your time in that position is over, that's a different thing than saying, "Lord, I'm going to serve you until I draw my last breath." That should be accompanied with holding our positions very lightly.
Yes.
And what she was talking about was holding the position strongly, not staying in ministry for the long term. Those are two very different things.
That's good. That's a good point to dry out. I would say that in the military ministry, we have the opportunity on a regular basis not to hold too tightly to anything because we are on the move every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, every time I catch up with you, it's like, okay, where are they now? Where are Lisa and Garrett now? Oh, there they are. Okay. It's got to be something you all would also love to do, I would imagine. Although there are a lot of small church pastors, especially, who that kind of fast moving around is not all that unusual in pastoral ministry as well, although there's a little more long-term in pastoral ministry than there used to be. Let's move from that. So we've talked now about not being in the way for those who are coming up, but let's get beyond just simply I'm not in the way. What are some of the ways that you would suggest we can help to mentor the younger ministers who are coming behind us, that we can use our decades of experience and seniority to be able to add something? Let's do the Grandma Moses here now. How do we grandma some of the folks that are coming up right now and let them know, hey, not only am I going to stick around, but I'm not going to be in the way, and I'm going to help you maybe learn some lessons that I had to learn the hard way because maybe somebody wasn't there to help me, and I want to be there to help you.
I could tell you what that looks like for me. So when I started out, and even to this day, we'll come across a soldier very often, and they'll look, or even a leader that says, "Oh, I've never seen a woman chaplain before." Like, well, I'm glad to be the first, and I will let you know I'm in the presence of many good women chaplains across the Army, across all branches of the military. But we were used to being the only one wherever we showed up. We got used to being the only female voice in the room. And we're not talking chaplains, we're talking about military leaders. And sometimes we would even lack, I think I lack my own self-awareness. My husband would say, I come home and I'd be frustrated after going to a command staff. And he said, Lisa, he said, your commander has never heard someone speak those words in a female voice before. And you need to kind of unpack that. I'm like, oh, okay. And so because of so many years of just taking it for granted, almost being unaware of, oh yeah, I'm a female, I'm a woman, because I'm just doing this thing. We're wearing the same uniform as our male counterparts. We're not really, we just do this. We just step out. And realizing that, remembering how I felt though, when another female chaplain was co-located with me in that place, especially on that first deployment, and she wasn't supposed to stay there. Her unit ended up being part of a theater reserve before they passed into Iraq, but she was there 7 months. And so imagine 2 female chaplains walking around during the surge as 40,000 troops are going through our camp. We would get it all the time. Oh, I've never seen female chaplains too. And it was, we're unicorns, and I'm still a unicorn. Here I am. I'm still a unicorn. I was actually given a unicorn at our Women of the Army Chaplain Corps training last year. And I thought, wow, I'm a unicorn. I'm not just old, I'm a unicorn because I'm still here. But what I've done is wherever I'm stationed in the last few years, I gather the chaplain sisters, in all 3 compos, National Guard, Army Reserve, IRR, and active duty. And very often, and we're all different denominations. And I will tell you, over a meal, there's laughter, there's tears, there's prayer, and we heal each other. Healing is there as we share our stories and we encourage each other. And because we have different battles, just being a woman in the military and then being a woman chaplain in the military, there's a lot of things that aren't talked about, but you know that we serve with other Christian ministers who theologically are opposed to our very presence in ministry. And I'm so blessed to be part of a denomination where, we don't have to think too hard about that. It's about we keep it about the Great Commission, what Jesus said. And we remember who was present at the ascension, that it was of the 70, and many of those 70 were the women. He wasn't saying, hey, you guys over here, and none of you don't listen to this, but I'm going to tell everybody else to go out and preach the gospel and give the good news story. And so those relationships, that relational leadership skill and what we can bring. And it's so exciting to see these women chaplains now go out as they go, and they're finding out they're not just one of 2 or one of one now, because of where we are in the military and some very aggressive recruiting that our chief of chaplains has said, that we need to bring up a higher representation who's actually in the military. And we think about how many women are now in our military as well as men. We absolutely need that, even though we all minister to everyone. And so seeing that generation go out and say, you know what, that was something I benefited from. Now it's my turn to host, to bring people over, have a lunch, get together, and have a place to cry and laugh and eat and pray and heal our stories where maybe someone has not shown us hospitality. But how are we going to leverage that and be the people that we want to be the person that who you wish had been there for you.
Yeah. That was how I was summarizing it in my own head, was be the person you wish someone had been there for you, or maybe like someone who had been there for you if you were blessed with
Yes,
that.
and I definitely have both of those situations in different places.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, so much in this and such help for this. So I really encourage anybody who's in the position we're in, who is at a place of retirement age, and depending on the kind of ministry you've done, maybe you've done your time and you're done and you're not going to be in full-time ministry or paid ministry anymore, but you're going to find some place that's a slower pace. God bless you if that's where you are. But if you are like the two of us we're looking at some of the most productive years of our lives coming ahead, I encourage you to take the advice from here to pace yourself in a way that you can, run the race at the pace that the Lord is calling you to run, whatever that speed might be for the rest of your time in ministry. But I cannot let you go without the lightning round questions. All right. So you ready? Okay.
I hope so.
First, what are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to them?
A couple of things. I would say in the COVID and then the post-COVID environment is we had to get real savvy with how we were going to do pastoral care and counseling, how we're going to take care of our troops, our family members, and finding that secure server to do some online counseling. And even though we were doing that during COVID, it's also something we still use because we're a portable ministry, or we've got a portable congregation. And that I'm also a family life chaplain. That means I have a master's in marriage and counseling and psychology. I'm a trained family life chaplain by the Army, in addition to a master of divinity. And so I spend a lot of my time doing that deeper therapeutic counseling. And so I can do marriage counseling, I can do relationship counseling, do one-on-one. And that's so great. We've realized that that's unfettered us, and we're less bound by just the regular schedule. That's another self-care thing, what,
Sure.
I don't have time there. I do need to report late, but I can take care of a couple where maybe the spouse works during the day and evening's better for them anyway. And that's a great thing. And the challenge also is that what we are now receiving, the COVID generation, those who had to stay home, their freshman and sophomore, maybe those years of high school. And so what we're finding, the research is showing, if you talk to our higher education professionals, they will tell you that this generation of college students, this generation of military service members is somewhat delayed socially, emotionally. Doesn't mean that they won't be there, doesn't mean that they're broken, but they're at a different place. And so how we approach our care to them, and realizing that I definitely ascribe to what some people call Arthur Chickering's 7 stages of student development. I call that soldier development. The last thing we get as adults that makes us fully adult, according to that theory, is judgment, the ability to make good decisions versus not so good decisions. And so if you look at our population of young adults now, 17 through 19 and in their 20s, if they're 2 years approximately behind that curve, then we need to be a little bit more patient, but also hold them to a healthy standard for their own wellness and for those who they serve with, and how important, because one of the biggest things we learn in basic training in the military is it's not if you need a battle buddy, it's when. And that's a life skill for all of us. We all need to have that friend, that place where we can have that good friend who's going to be with us, even if we don't smell right or look right, always do the right thing. And it's such a life skill. And so I would say that challenge, and some of their questions are maybe even a little bit more innocent or naive, and not shaming them because they don't have the answers, or they're not into that space of full adulthood yet.
Yeah, that's great. Second question is, what free resource like an app or a website has helped you lately that you'd recommend for small church ministry?
I think the only app I'm using, and this would be for my personal care, but that I can recommend, is Elizabeth Fulgaro's Eagle's Nest. And she's done a lot of research with women veterans, but it's also applicable to other people where she's used hymns, and not because she's a great singer. So if you're looking for somebody who's an awesome singer, I love how her in humility, you can go to her app, Eagle's Nest, and she has shown that the healing properties of listening to hymns and even choosing the kinds of hymns for soul care, song prayers, where prayers being sung. That's a great thing. That's for me, because I am a combat veteran. I might have some issues, or I might get triggered with it. But all of us, whether you've served the military or not, we've all had trauma in our lives. So to have that, be able to refer people to the Eagle's Nest app is a great thing you can download on your phone. So that's something you can refer. I have a few books. Can I share just a couple?
Sure, absolutely.
Because I'm a family life counselor, also, I talk about things that a lot of chaplains, I would say a lot of maybe our male chaplains might be uncomfortable with, and a lot of chaplains who don't have the extra education. I do talk about intimate issues, and our identity is a big thing in our culture. It is in the military, our sexual identity, our experiences and our confidence level and relationships are the key thing of what will cause somebody to consider a permanent solution to a temporary problem, to act out, maybe that suicide ideation. So what I really have enjoyed, what's been helpful to my ministry in one-on-one or in groups, is be able to talk about Shannon Ethridge's fantasy fallacy. It was her response, a faith response to the 50 Shades of Grey. And so she unpacks that for us, that fantasy is a gift from God. It is not a roadmap to your future, but it informs you of where you've come from and why things may be very early on in our childhood exposed us to some things that were unhelpful. And then Jay Stringer's Unwanted, how sexual brokenness reveals our way to healing. If we are a healed caregiver, a healed spiritual leader, we're going to have that competency and that confidence to lead people to shame-free, judgment-free places of healing also for the individual, for marriages, relationships. And then I would say the other thing that in the Chaplain Corps we've used a lot is Dr. Lisa Miller's The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality, and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. And she really gets after that there's evidence, there's scientific evidence. It says if you have a faith, if you have a God, you are better off because of it. If you subscribe to a faith and a God who informs your life and your spirituality. And so there's a whole lot there. The fun one, and it's an easy read, I highly recommend, is Dr. Angela Garrell-Williams, The Gravity of Joy. And she talks about extreme grief and how she got to the place of joy. And it's her story to tell, but I highly encourage it. I give that as a gift, probably most often when I find someone, whether in the civilian world or in the military community, who is right up against the most unfathomable event of their life.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll put links to all of those in the show notes. Number 3, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
That came from Reverend Constance Pack of Calvary Temple, a Global Outreach Bible Institute. I have never forgot these 2 words, and they have served me and still can continue to serve me the best. Be flexible. And the military term for that is adaptable.
Yeah. And in the small church ministry, it's just as applicable. Absolutely. Last one. What's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
There's some things I can't tell you that keep me laughing, but the one I can tell you, this is recently, it was a group of Muslim soldiers, and a lot of people don't realize the only reason that chaplains exist in the military is for the free exercise of religion, according to our Constitution. It's a beautiful thing that gives us place. And so part of that is also caring for other souls that we may not identify with. And so we were at a breaking of the fast at the Eid dinner, and we, at that time, a few months ago, we didn't have a Muslim chaplain. And so we put on a very reputable, our comrade chaplain up so they could hear a blessing and some words of wisdom from their faith. And when the film was over, they all came around me and they said, and these were all young men, they said, "Chaplain," they said, "what was that soldier's job? What was his MOS, their military occupational specialty?" I go, "Oh, that's called 56 Alpha. That means they're a chaplain." I'm like, "Oh, wow. How do we get that job? Because that's awesome." I said, "Wow. Well, let me tell you." And so we had we had some spiritual formation calling, vocational calling conversations and about how you need to get your college education. You need to get a seminary degree, and then you need to be endorsed by your church. So right now, there's my shameless plug for anybody who might consider the call to become a military chaplain. And I'm very open to having that discussion with folks.
Yeah, you'll find yourself in opportunities for ministry and chaplaincy that you will not find anywhere else in the world. Now, one thing I did not mention earlier, and I meant to, was we will have bonus material for this. And what I want to do is I want to talk to you about some of the challenges of being a woman in ministry. So as you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of our listeners are from complementarian backgrounds. And that is a debate that we have within the church, whether or not women can serve in particular areas of ministry or not. The denomination that you and I grow up in and still serve in has never had an issue with that. But I respect and understand the complementarian standpoint. So if you're complementarian and that's not for you, then don't worry about going to the bonus material. But for those who are interested in, we'll take a few minutes just to talk about some of the challenges of being a woman in ministry. So if you are interested in getting this or any of the other bonus material that we do for any of our podcasts, go to karlvaters.com/support. Become a monthly supporter. You'll get the free weekly newsletter with all the links to all the bonus material, or for free, you can get it as well. karlvaters.com/subscribe, and you'll get the free weekly newsletter. Every week, there is a link to the bonus material for all of the podcasts that we do. So we're going to finish this out. We'll take a break. We'll record that, and you can go over and get that if you are a regular subscriber. But if anybody does want to, particularly, this has sparked interest in military chaplaincy, what should they do? What's their first step? Is there somebody to get a hold of? Is there a website that they go to? How do they begin that process?
Yes, typically we refer people to goarmy.com, but I am quite comfortable in having someone contact me personally. My email is chaplain@lisanorthway.com, and I will put them in touch with a chaplain recruiter. I'll be able to answer initial questions, but I'm happy. I've made a commitment to being a guide for that. The other thing my mentor first told me is we need to be about the business of recruiting our replacements. And when I first met her, that first month, she said, "Oh, you're my replacement." And I was very humbling because I knew she was airborne, very hua in the military. I'm never jumping out of airplanes. That doesn't make any sense. But so I didn't feel like I was truly like her replacement. But I realized what she meant, and I thought about that. So I realized, especially in these transition years, I'm not looking for my replacements.
Right. We will put your email address then in the show notes so that people can reach out to you if they want to. Lisa, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your wisdom. And from the bottom of our hearts as American citizens, thank you and those you serve with for your service, how you have blessed and continue to bless and serve this country. We could not be more grateful.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor, and that I still get to do this amazing ministry.
Wonderful. Serving in ministry past retirement age sounds great for a lot of us, not so great for some of us, but how do we prepare ourselves to do so for those of us who want to extend our ministry years? Well, as Lisa mentioned, it's important to find times to recover from those high impact periods with slower, more purposeful times of rest. My additional thought to that is this: the longer you serve in ministry, the more proactive you should make your schedule. In the early years of ministry, we tend to react to a lot of what happens. We're still trying to figure out what we're good at, where to devote most of our time, and so on. But as we figure some of that out, it's essential to become the coordinator of your own schedule instead of letting others do it for you. Yes, there will always be last-minute things we need to react to, but we need to make those as few as possible. Being proactive instead of always reactive will help us expend energy in sustainable ways. It will give us proper times of rest, which we need to make sure that we put on the schedule and do. And it helps us to prioritize our time and skills for the greatest benefit with the least amount of energy expended. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.